What if I told you that one of the most powerful popes in history was also the father of murderers, a defender of incest, and the architect of a network of corruption that nearly destroyed the Catholic Church from within? Over the centuries, the name Borgia has become synonymous with poison, lust, and ruthless power. However, few know that their story is not just a series of crimes, but a cruel mirror of what happens when the sacred becomes a tool of ambition. We will reveal the darkest secrets of Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesare, the cardinal who became an executioner, and his daughter Lucrezia, the victim and accomplice of a tragedy that cast a shadow over all of Europe. This is not fiction. It all took place under the vaults of the Holy See, and even today its echoes continue to pollute the faith, politics, and soul of our institutions. Prepare to enter the rotting heart of the Renaissance Vatican. This is the story of the Borgias and how absolute power destroys even the most sacred. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in the Kingdom of Aragon, which at the time was part of a complex network of Christian crowns vying for power and influence on the Iberian Peninsula. From birth, Rodrigo was blessed, or perhaps cursed, with a legacy deeply connected to the Catholic Church. His surname, Borgia, derived from the original Borja, was well known in ecclesiastical circles thanks to his maternal uncle Alonso de Borja, who was not only the Bishop of Valencia, but later became Pope Calixtus III. This direct connection to the papal throne from a very young age put Rodrigo in a privileged position that many could only dream of. His noble family, although not extremely wealthy, found in the church not only spiritual refuge, but above all a path to social and political advancement. A family career in the church was not a calling of the soul, but a strategy of power, passed down and calculated. The environment in which Rodrigo grew up taught him that the church was not only a sanctuary of prayer, but also fertile ground for earthly ambitions. The figure of his uncle as pope and his connections with other influential relatives in the church hierarchy made it clear that divine power could be used for personal gain if you knew the rules of the game. Thus, while other boys his age were learning catechism, Rodrigo was studying the hidden language of church politics, observing how faith could become currency in the halls of the Vatican. This family legacy, filled with power, influence, and proximity to the papal throne, became the foundation for everything that followed, a life full of boundless ambition, ruthless manipulation, and a thirst for power that knew no moral boundaries. Rodrigo Borgia was not a monster from birth, but his environment gave him all the tools to become one. From a very young age, Rodrigo understood what most people of his time only realized decades later. Power does not always go to the most righteous, but to those who are more cunning. His sharp mind, innate charisma, and ability to discern others' motives made him a rapidly rising and extremely dangerous figure in the church, where politics and spirituality always existed in a delicate balance. Unlike other members of the clergy, who sought to serve God with devotion and spiritual purpose, Rodrigo saw the church as the ideal stage for displaying his political talents. His view of the priesthood was less heavenly and more pragmatic. He did not seek to serve God, but used faith as a tool for personal advancement. He studied canon law at the University of Bologna, not out of love for divine law, but because he understood that knowledge of the rules was the first step to learning how to manipulate them. During his studies, he built strategic connections with noble families, clergy, powerful figures, and diplomats from various European courts, always displaying an impeccable facade of politeness and devotion that concealed his unbridled ambition. Rodrigo quickly proved that he had a clear understanding of power. It was not achieved through prayer, but through negotiation, exchange of services, building loyalty, and, if necessary, elegant betrayal. Even in his youth, his methods did not go unnoticed. While other young candidates were content with parishes or minor positions, he aspired to greater things. Much greater things. The modesty of the clergy was not a virtue in his strategic leadership, but merely a weakness to be avoided. Rodrigo saw the papacy as a legitimate and achievable goal, not as a divine calling, but as the most powerful political throne in Europe. His audacity and lack of moral barriers were well known among his contemporaries, but they were not an obstacle in the Church of the 15th century, which was rife with corruption, unethical behavior, and power struggles. In this context, Rodrigo did not stand out. He was simply better prepared than others. His early ambition was not considered a moral deviation by the standards of the time, but rather a sign of skill. Rodrigo Borgia did not simply want to climb the career ladder. He wanted to dominate. In 1456, Rodrigo Borgia reached a milestone that for many would have been the culmination of a church career. He was appointed cardinal, even though he was only 25 years old. However, instead of viewing this appointment as a spiritual consecration or a duty to serve as a shepherd of the church, Rodrigo saw it as another step toward his true goal, the papal throne. His entry into the College of Cardinals was not the result of a desire to serve, but a carefully thought-out strategy. From that moment on, he began to build political alliances with the most influential families in Rome and the Italian states. He understood that power did not lie solely in prayers or sacred decrees, but in the influence exerted behind the scenes, in favors, promises, and carefully concealed secrets. Rodrigo stood out for his ability to move elegantly through the dark corners of the Vatican, creating the appearance of humility while accumulating favors and allies. The church positions he received were not ends in themselves, but merely tools he used for his personal ambitions. Unlike other cardinals who still retained at least some religious devotion, Rodrigo saw each new promotion as an opportunity to increase his wealth, expand his influence, and strengthen his network of clients. He was willing to use any means necessary, including bribes, strategic marriages, subtle threats, or temporary alliances with sworn enemies. His surname, which was already beginning to cause discontent among church circles, quickly became synonymous with cunning and ambition. Rodrigo made no secret of his contempt for the ideals of humility, chastity, or sacrifice. For him, the church was a battlefield, and the cardinal's sword was his armor. His style was straightforward but seductive, calculating but effective. Years before the possibility of occupying the papal throne even arose, he already behaved as if he had a divine right to the position. While believers attended Mass in the hope of salvation, Rodrigo visited the Vatican to plan his coronation. He was not a pastor, he was a strategist. He was not a saint, he was an architect of power. Cardinal Borgia was not a defender of souls, but a creator of a future where the papacy would become the center of his personal dynasty, and no one in Rome or beyond could stop him. The death of Pope Innocent VIII in July 1492 triggered one of the most corrupt and scandalous papal elections in the history of the Church. Instead of a spiritual process inspired by prayer and divine inspiration, the conclave became a fierce struggle for power, where the rules of the game included intrigue, bribery, and manipulation. Rodrigo Borgia, with decades of experience in Vatican affairs, saw this vacancy as his decisive opportunity to fulfill his darkest ambition, to don the papal tiara and become the absolute leader of Christianity. He understood that it was not enough to be the most pious or wise. One had to be the most cunning and generous in one's promises. During the conclave, Rodrigo launched a secret campaign to buy votes, handing out future positions, land, titles, and even money to key cardinals. His rivals, though powerful, could not match his ability to offer tempting rewards to voters. The rooms of the Vatican were filled with rumors, promises exchanged in the dark, deals sealed with expensive wine and gold coins. Rodrigo played every card with surgical precision and without the slightest twinge of conscience. It was not a choice, but an auction, and the best bidder, without a doubt, was him. Among the main rivals in the conclave of 1492 was a formidable opponent, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. A man with a harsh character and a militaristic view of the papacy, he also had a powerful family. Giuliano was not naive about the corruption of the process. He knew the internal dynamics of the Vatican and was ready to fight for the papal tiara with the same intensity as Rodrigo Borgia. However, while Giuliano relied on his reputation, family prestige, and the support of some conservative circles in the Curia, Rodrigo played on a different level, that of outright vote-buying. De la Robert had a solid base, but he underestimated the effectiveness of Borgia's methods. The Spaniard, cunning and calculating, had already secured a majority of votes before Giuliano could react. He promised bishoprics, lands, and even indulgences in exchange for support. Giuliano, disappointed, saw his rival rise thanks to a network of carefully calculated bribes. The defeat did not destroy him, but it left a deep mark. For many years he harbored hatred for Alexander the Sixth, and later, as Pope Julius II, he became one of the main enemies of the Borgia family. But in 1492, the game was decided. Rodrigo not only defeated his enemies, but also showed them that in Renaissance Rome, faith could be bought. On August 11, 1492, after weeks of secret maneuvers, exchanges of promises, and securing votes with bribes, Rodrigo Borgia was finally elected the new pope. He took the name Alexander VI, a title that, in theory, symbolized spiritual renewal, but soon became synonymous with corruption and scandal. His ascension was publicly celebrated with great pomp, processions, songs, fireworks, and lavish feasts that adorned the streets of Rome as if a saint had been elected. But in the quiet corridors of the Vatican, many whispered with concern. It was no secret that his election had been bought. Many knew that beneath the white robes of the new pope was the same man who had built his career on favors, threats, and shady deals. However, Alexander VI made no effort to hide his true intentions. From day one, he made it clear that his papacy would not be based on humility or Christian sacrifice, but on strengthening family power, personal wealth, and absolute control over the church machine. His election did not mark the beginning of a holy era, but was the official opening of one of the darkest periods in the history of Western Christianity. Rome chose not a pastor, but an emperor disguised as a pontiff. As soon as he took the throne of St. Peter, Alexander VI immediately began to turn the papacy into a family business. He made no attempt to hide his intentions and made the Holy See the center of a network of power designed to enrich and strengthen his relatives. His strategy was clear from the outset: to surround himself with members of the Borgia family so that every corner of the Vatican would be subject to his interests. One of the most scandalous moves was the appointment of his son, Cesare Borgia, as cardinal when he was only 15 years old. This was clearly an inappropriate age for such a high ecclesiastical office, especially considering that he had no spiritual education or religious calling. The message was clear: merit was not important, only family loyalty. And this was not the only such appointment. Alexander VI placed his cousins, nephews, and allies in key positions, from influential dioceses to important diplomatic posts. This system of nepotism not only undermined the legitimacy of the papacy in the eyes of the people, but also caused deep discontent among traditional cardinals, many of whom saw their years of service ignored in favor of ambitious teenagers with the right surname. Instead of leading Christ's flock, the Pope ruled like a feudal patriarch, where the Borgia name became the only valid recommendation for advancement in the church hierarchy. With each new appointment, the spiritual authority of the church was destroyed, replaced by a system of patronage so blatant that it became offensive. And while the people prayed for holy leadership, Alexander VI strengthened his dynasty as if it were a secular kingdom, placing the interests of his family above Christian principles. Within the power structure created by Alexander VI, his daughter Lucrezia Borgia occupied a key position. From an early age, she was used as a political tool in a series of strategic marriages aimed at strengthening alliances with the most influential houses in Italy. Each marriage arranged by the Pope was not an act of love or family affection, but a carefully thought-out game of political power. At the age of 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a member of one of the most powerful families in the north. But when this union lost its usefulness, Alexander did not hesitate to annul the marriage on the humiliating pretext of impotence, destroying the reputation of her young husband. He then married her off to the Duke of Aragon, who was soon killed under suspicious circumstances, and many believe that Cesare Borgia himself was behind it. Lucrezia, caught between her father's ambitions and her brother's cruelty, led a life of outward luxury but inward isolation. Soon the darkest rumors began to circulate about her incestuous relationship with her father, her involvement in poisonings, and even unknown pregnancies. Although there is no definitive proof of these accusations, the spread of such rumors showed how much the public reputation of the papacy had deteriorated. Lucrezia was both a symbol of the Borgias' unbridled splendor and a victim of a patriarchal and political system that treated her as a mere bargaining chip. Behind the luxurious dresses and smiles at Vatican receptions was a young woman trapped in a web of manipulation, used to forge political alliances, while her dignity and freedom were systematically sacrificed. In her father's hands, faith became a commodity, and his daughter became the price for every agreement. The papacy of Alexander VI was marked not only by political ambition and unrestrained nepotism, but also by a lifestyle that destroyed all notions of papal dignity. While the Romans suffered from hunger, crime, and daily poverty, the Vatican became a palace of pleasure where lavish feasts, endless celebrations, and sexual relations became commonplace. Alexander VI made no secret of his love affairs and the children he had with various women, many of whom were officially recognized and received titles, lands, and positions. His most famous mistress, Vanosa Catani, was the mother of several of his children, including Cesare and Lucrezia, and lived for many years surrounded by privileges and honors. Later, when Vanosa grew old, Alexander redirected his affections to Julia Farnese, a young woman of stunning beauty. She was called the Pope's concubine, and her influence in the Vatican became enormous. The corridors of the Apostolic Palace were filled with scandals and rumors of power, intertwined with passion, creating an atmosphere increasingly steeped in immorality. The image of the Pope, who was supposed to be a symbol of chastity, humility, and devotion, became an emblem of excess, lust, and decadence. Under his leadership, the papal curia ceased to be a center of holiness and became a stage for sensational intrigues, where faith served as a backdrop for a theater of corruption. Even the enemies of the papacy, both within the church and outside it, found in his daily behavior many reasons to doubt the spiritual legitimacy of his rule. Alexander VI not only abused papal power for political purposes, but also desecrated the body of Christ, turning the Vatican into his personal arena and leaving a moral wound in the institution that would take centuries to heal. The figure of Cesare Borgia, son of Alexander VI, is perhaps the most cruel and fascinating face of power, exercised without moral restraint. Appointed cardinal at the age of 15 on his father's direct orders, Cesare never showed any religious vocation and did not respect the principles of the clergy. The purple vestments that symbolized his consecration to God were, for him, heavy armor imposed from outside, and his true ambitions lay not within the sacred walls of the Vatican, but on the battlefields. Instead of preaching the gospel, Cesare longed to lead armies, capture cities, and leave his name in Italian history. After years of diplomatic maneuvering and using his privileged position as the Pope's son, he obtained the right to renounce his cardinalate, an unprecedented gesture. This was more a declaration of war than a spiritual renunciation. Freed from his religious mask, Cesare became the armed wing of the Borgia family. He was appointed commander of the papal armies and soon began a ruthless military campaign to create a centralized state under his control. He captured castles, suppressed opposition, and humiliated princes using brutal military tactics. With each victory, he strengthened not only his own power, but also Alexander VI's vision of a papacy that was no longer a spiritual leadership, but a platform for territorial domination. Cesare acted not as a general in the service of the Church, but as a Renaissance prince whose army bore the seal of the Vatican and the divine protection of his father. His figure embodied the politics, violence, and silent heresy of a system that had exchanged the cross for the sword. His transformation from cardinal to conqueror was more than a personal transformation. It was the embodiment of the absolute corruption of ecclesiastical power in the hands of a family determined to rule at any cost. Freed from the constraints of the Church and becoming commander of the army, Cesare Borgia deployed a strategy based not on legitimacy or negotiation, but on fear as the primary instrument of control. He did not simply want to rule. He wanted to be feared, respected for the terror he inspired, and for the certainty that his enemies would not get a second chance. Each of his campaigns in central Italy was marked by methodical violence aimed at sending a clear message. Betrayal was punished with blood. Cesare did not hesitate to use murder as a political tactic, eliminating rivals both within his ranks and beyond. Defeated enemies were hanged in public squares, while allies were cleverly eliminated in ambushes, organized with surgical precision. Local rulers were replaced by loyal figures whose lives and fortunes depended on the Borgias. Machiavelli himself, who witnessed several of his maneuvers, was struck by Cesare's ability to combine diplomatic cunning with military cruelty, and immortalized him as a model prince in his famous work, The Prince. Under his command, fear was not a random emotion, but a calculated method. His name became synonymous with swift death, absolute power, and punishment without mercy. But what was more terrifying than severed heads and conquered territories was the impunity with which he acted. As the son of the Pope, Cesare feared neither kings nor excommunication from the Church. His power was based on the blessing of the Vatican and his father's indifference to any bloodshed, as long as it served to expand the family's influence. In Renaissance Italy, fear was more effective than faith, and Cesare knew this better than anyone. Cesare Borgia's rise as commander of the army was not an isolated act, but part of a much broader scheme that turned the papacy into a machine of domination, created from the threads of one family, the Borgias. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican ceased to be a spiritual center and became the headquarters of an authoritarian regime where everything revolved around perpetuating family power. Every papal decision, every appointment, every alliance was aimed not at serving Christianity, but at strengthening the internal structure of this dynasty, which ruled with a cross in one hand and a dagger in the other. Cesare was the armed wing. Lucrezia was the key to the aristocrats' homes, and Alexander was the patriarch immune to punishment, who manipulated God's will as he saw fit. The Borgias not only dominated Italian politics, but also the very soul of the Church, corrupting its symbols, selling indulgences, and placing salvation in the hands of those who paid the most. The papal curia became a network of patronage, bribes, and secret agreements, where loyalty was bought and dissent was punished. No one was safe, not bishops, princes, or allies. The clan's enemies were relentlessly pursued, and their property was absorbed into Cesare's domains. The machine functioned with ruthless efficiency, fueled by fear, ambition, and the theological support of a pope willing to sacrifice any morality in order to see his family name in history as that of a ruling dynasty. Under this structure, Rome was no longer the capital of Christianity, but became the center of a dynasty that usurped the symbols of faith and turned them into instruments of secular domination. The Borgias created a church in their own image, powerful, fearsome, and deeply corrupt. During the papacy of Alexander VI, the papacy underwent a radical transformation in its essence. It ceased to be a spiritual ministry and became the supreme symbol of absolute power. The papal tiara, which once symbolized humility, sacrifice, and service to God, became an imperial crown serving the personal interests of the Borgias. The Vatican became a center of operations where the sacred was traded. Alexander VI viewed indulgences as a commodity on the market, promising divine forgiveness in exchange for money, which was used not to help the poor or strengthen the church, but to finance wars, build palaces, and enrich his children. Bishoprics, abbeys, and positions in the curia were also traded, going to the highest bidder, regardless of merit or calling, turning the church system into a vanity fair. Those who sought to advance in the church hierarchy knew that prayer and theology alone were not enough. They needed connections, gold, and a share in the spoils. Under his rule, the figure of the Pope was no longer the successor to St. Peter, but became the image of an unrestrained monarch whose word was law, whose hands signed agreements with kings, and whose pockets were filled with every mass. This absolutist concept of papal power was reflected in architecture, clothing, and protocol. Majestic processions, a throne decorated with gold, papal feasts worthy of an emperor. All this served as a theatrical display, concealing the spiritual emptiness of the institution. Alexander VI did not rule as a shepherd of souls, but as a Renaissance prince, and his papacy became a symbol of a church where the sacred was subordinate to politics, where the altar was a platform for domination, and where salvation was no longer a grace but a bargain. One of the most striking examples of the political use of his papal power was Alexander VI's intervention in the division of the New World between the crowns of Spain and Portugal. This step had not only spiritual, but also geopolitical consequences of colossal proportions. In 1494, under the protection of his papacy, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, an agreement that divided the newly discovered lands of America between the two Iberian empires. Spain was granted the right to all lands west of an imaginary line drawn across the Atlantic, while Portugal received the right to everything east of that line. This treaty was made possible by papal bulls issued by Alexander VI, which not only legitimized the division, but also sanctified it with divine authority. However, what at first glance appeared to be spiritual arbitration was in fact an agreement full of hidden interests. In exchange for granting Spain control over vast regions of America, the Pope received promises of political support, funding for family campaigns, and greater influence at the Castilian court. The colonization of America began not only with caravels, but also with the pen of Pope Borgia, who unhesitatingly signed the death warrant of millions of indigenous peoples, sending them into foreign domination. Instead of defending justice or evangelical ethics, Alexander VI used his power for the benefit of the Allied powers, ignoring the human, cultural, and spiritual consequences of such a division. With his signature, the Vatican became a major force in one of the most ambitious divisions of empires in history, where souls not yet converted to Christianity were seen as territories to be conquered and exploited. the papacy ceased to be the arbiter of universal faith and became the mediator of empires, and Alexander VI, instead of showing remorse, celebrated the agreement as a diplomatic victory that placed him in the role of mediator between kings and symbolic master of entire continents, even though it meant officially blessing plunder. While Alexander VI focused his attention on securing international alliances and expanding the Borgia's power beyond Italy, the heart of the peninsula was plunging into growing chaos, fueled by corruption, patronage, and a complete lack of moral leadership. The Papal States, which were supposed to be an example of stability and Christian righteousness, became the epicenter of intrigue, abuse of power, and clashes between factions. Rome, under the rule of the Borgias, was no longer a holy city, but a capital plunged into fear and disorder, where papal decisions depended more on family whims than on the needs of the people or the church. Citizens lived in constant tension, knowing that any conflict between noble families or enmity with Cesare could lead to public executions, violent confiscations, or political persecution. The papal administration, infected with officials loyal exclusively to the pontiff's family, functioned as an apparatus of institutionalized extortion. Taxes were raised to finance Cesare's military campaigns, courts were rigged in favor of the pope's allies, and monasteries were plundered to support the luxury of the papal curia. At the same time, foreign powers such as France and the Holy Roman Empire watched the Italian turmoil with growing concern, preparing future interventions that would alter the European balance of power. Alexander VI's lack of foresight, blinded by personal ambition, left Italy fragmented, vulnerable, and ready to be swallowed up by external powers. The Church's promise to be a mentor and protector vanished, leaving behind only an organization preoccupied with survival and enriching its own family. Under the Borgia's rule, the spiritual center of Christianity degenerated into a scene of rampant corruption and political chaos that engulfed not only Rome, but the entire peninsula. As the Borgia's power reached its peak, so did the discontent of their numerous enemies both inside and outside the Vatican. The politics of fear introduced by Alexander VI and implemented with an iron fist by Cesare Borgia created a network of forced alliances, unstable agreements, and hidden betrayals that were bound to explode sooner or later. Many cardinals who had once supported Rodrigo Borgia in his ascent to the papal throne began to watch with horror as his promises of spiritual reform turned into sexual scandals, open corruption, and an unprecedented concentration of power. The Roman aristocracy, humiliated and displaced by the appointments of the Pope's relatives and allies, began to secretly talk about restoring the lost balance. Outside Rome, in cities such as Florence, Milan, and Naples, local rulers no longer viewed the Pope as a neutral arbiter, but as an ambitious leader whose family threatened to swallow up all of central Italy. Even in Alexander VI's immediate circle, tensions were rising. His children, who were becoming increasingly independent, began to have their own plans, and his authority as a father and as Pope was weakening in the face of internal conflicts. Foreign ambassadors reported to their courts on the growing instability in Rome, describing it as a city taken over by a family whose excesses had exceeded the limits of tolerance. In this atmosphere of growing hostility, conspiracies, secret alliances, and resistance movements began to emerge, some of which were quiet while others were openly armed. Alexander VI, accustomed to subjugating the will of the people through bribes or threats, seemed unable to understand that fear has its limits, and when those limits are crossed, rebellion ensues. What had once been fear now turned into organized hatred, and what had once been obedience began to transform into conspiracy. On August 18, 1503, Alexander VI's life came to an unexpected end, in circumstances that remain shrouded in mystery, suspicion, and dark symbolism to this day. It was officially reported that the Pope died of a sudden fever, an illness that also struck his son Cesare around the same time, leading many to suspect that they had been poisoned. Some chroniclers of the time claimed that both had attended banquets where, either by mistake or through treachery, they had ingested poison intended for one of their enemies. Others ironically suggested that God himself had decided to put an end to an era of unbearable corruption. Whatever the truth may have been, Alexander VI's death was as repulsive as it was symbolic. His body decomposed at an extraordinary rate, swelling, blackening, and emitting an unbearable odor, forcing servants to seal the room before they could begin embalming him. The story of his distorted body became a metaphor for his papacy, a body corrupted from within, which in the end could not hide its decadence. For many, it was divine justice. For others, earthly revenge, and for those closest to him, the beginning of an inevitable collapse. His death left Cesare in serious illness and without the papal protection that had shielded him from his enemies. The Borgia dynasty, built over decades on blood, gold, and manipulation, began to falter without its central figure. Alexander VI did not die a saint, surrounded by prayers, but a tyrant, abandoned by all, perhaps falling victim to the same poison he had so often endured or used. His end was not only biological, but also symbolic. The end of unpunished rule that had brought the papacy to the brink of collapse. Alexander VI's death left not only a vacuum on St. Peter's throne, but also abruptly shattered the power structure that the Borgias had carefully built over decades. Without the figure of the Pope as a shield and instrument, Cesare Borgia was left defenseless, sick, and vulnerable to a network of enemies who had long awaited this moment. Allies began to desert. Pacts signed under pressure fell apart, and cities captured by blood began to rebel against the young leader's authority. Cesare, still weakened by the fever that had nearly killed him, tried to maintain control with urgent letters, threats, and desperate maneuvers. But fear no longer worked as it had before. Without the support of the pontiff, his orders lost their legitimacy. The Vatican, which had been controlled like a dynastic court for more than a decade, became the scene of chaotic disputes between factions seeking to restore the lost order or, in other cases, to avenge years of humiliation. The new conclave was preparing in an atmosphere of open conspiracy, where everyone knew that the choice of the next pope would determine Cesare's fate. Meanwhile, the captured territories began to disintegrate. Enemies within began to take up arms, and ambassadors from foreign powers pressed for radical changes. The fall was not immediate, but it became inevitable. Without his father, Cesare was just an ambitious young man surrounded by swords. What had once been an unstoppable dynasty was now a shaky structure supported by fear, gold, and increasingly costly betrayals. The Borgia family empire, deprived of its core, began to crumble from within, consumed by the same greed that had nourished it. After the death of Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia fought fiercely to maintain control over the territorial empire his father had helped him create. But time was no longer on his side. Sick, physically and politically weakened, he faced a reality in which his enemies, previously held back by fear of papal authority, now rose up with new determination. His former allies abandoned him. The nobles reclaimed their lands, and the conquered cities, one by one, declared their independence. In Rome, the new pope, Julius II, a declared enemy of the Borgias, began a systematic purge of everyone who had ever been part of Rodrigo and Cesare's circle of power. Deprived of the papal army, political legitimacy, and economic control, Cesare was arrested and imprisoned in Spain, betrayed even by those who had previously owed their positions to him. From prison, he continued to write letters in a commanding tone, as if he did not accept that his world was collapsing. He eventually managed to escape, but he was no longer the formidable military prince whom everyone feared. He had become a fugitive without a homeland, hunted and cornered. He found refuge in Navarre under the protection of his brother-in-law, but even there, luck was against him. In a poorly organized ambush, he was killed at the age of 31, alone in the mud, without soldiers to defend him, without a family to mourn him. The man who had aspired to become the great lord of Italy died like a bandit, killed in a local skirmish. His fall was not only physical, but also the complete destruction of his dream of absolute domination. The Borgia family, which once made kings and cardinals tremble, was now a shadow of its former glory, broken, discredited, and condemned to exile. This is how the Borgia Empire ended, not in a final war, but in a slow decay fueled by the hatred they had sown over the years and the absence of redemption. While Cesare fell from grace, Lucrezia Borgia, his sister, took a radically different path, the path of rebirth. After becoming the center of numerous scandals and the subject of rumors portraying her as incestuous, a poisoner, and a manipulator, Lucrezia attempted to rid herself of her family's shameful legacy by finding refuge in marriage to Alfonso III, Duke of Ferrara. This new union not only provided her with prestige, but also gave her the opportunity to start a new life away from Rome. At the court of Ferrara, Lucrezia surrounded herself with artists, poets, and humanists, cultivating the image of a pious, educated, and refined woman, a patron of the Renaissance, and a devoted mother. But her past continued to haunt her. Although she tried to erase the years she had spent in the shadow of her father and brother, the Italian aristocracy and European chronicles did not forget her origins. For many, she remained the daughter of a corrupt pope and the sister of a tyrant, and her every move was carefully analyzed with malice. Sex scandals, marriages of convenience, and suspicions of murder all remained a stain on her biography. Even her charitable activities were viewed with cynicism, as attempts at personal redemption rather than true virtue. Her life, though calmer compared to the violence that accompanied the Borgias' rise to power, was never completely free. Her surname was a burden, and public opinion was merciless. Lucrezia tried to atone for her sins. Yes, but in an era when reputation was destiny, she realized that escaping the past was not always enough to cleanse it. Despite the efforts of the surviving members of the Borgia family to rebuild their lives away from scandal, the family name remained a sentence. None of them could escape the stigma that had been cultivated over the years as a sign of corruption, excessive ambition, and moral decay. Lucrezia, although she became a respected duchess in Ferrara, was never able to erase from the collective memory the rumors of incest, poisoning, and manipulation that surrounded her. Cesare, even though he was young and died in exile, continued to be perceived as a symbol of a ruthless and unprincipled Renaissance tyrant. And Alexander VI, the Patriarch, forever remained in the chronicles as the Pope who sold the soul of the Church for earthly power. The descendants of the Borgias tried for generations to dilute their blood, change their names, and adapt to new courts and eras. But the moral judgment of history was relentless. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption and sin, used by moralist writers and reformers as an example of what happens when absolute power corrupts without measure. Even those who defended them, arguing that they were victims of a cruel era, acknowledged that their image was irretrievably damaged. In the halls of Europe, in universities, in church pulpits, the Borgia name was mentioned with contempt or fear, but never with indifference. Their legacy was neither wealth nor honor. It was legend. They tried to atone for their sins, to hide or justify their actions, but nothing helped. Because the Borgia legacy was not one that could be cleansed. It was an open wound in the memory of the Church, a living warning of how far the human soul can fall when power becomes God. The death of Alexander VI not only put an end to a controversial family, but also left the Catholic Church in a crisis of confidence of unprecedented proportions. The papacy, which for centuries had embodied the moral and spiritual authority of millions of believers, emerged from the Borgia era with its image completely destroyed. The figure of the Pope, once revered as the Vicar of Christ, had been debased by years of nepotism, the outright sale of indulgences, the trading of church offices, and sexual scandals. For many believers, it was already impossible to distinguish the pontiff from a corrupt prince. Altars became political thrones, prayers became bargaining chips, and the Vatican became a court comparable to any decadent kingdom. Indignation was no longer a whisper among theologians, but a cry among peasants, bourgeois, and nobles. How could the Church preach humility when its leader lived in luxury and protected murderers and corrupt people? The cardinals were divided between those who wanted to preserve the system and those who feared that the entire structure would collapse. The moral authority of the papacy was destroyed from within, and mistrust was now directed not only at Alexander VI, but at the entire institution that tolerated and supported him. It was a church in ruins, exhausted by centuries of accumulated power, blinded by ambition, and completely detached from its spiritual mission. And although they tried to restore their reputation with new, more ascetic popes, the damage had already been done, and the very idea of the papacy had lost its sanctity in the eyes of the world. The Borgia era not only tarnished the prestige of the papacy, but also sowed the seeds that would sprout with fury throughout Europe, the seeds of the Reformation. The abuse of papal power, sexual scandals, political wars financed by church money, and the outright sale of indulgences caused a wave of disappointment, even among the most devout believers. For millions of Christians, the Church was no longer the path to God, but a corrupt machine trading in the souls of believers. This perception was not merely an emotional reaction, it was based on concrete and visible facts. The scandals of Alexander VI and his children, the obscene accumulation of wealth by the clergy, the economic oppression of peasants in the name of tithing, and the arrogance of the Vatican created fertile ground for a theological uprising. It was in this context of disappointment and pain that Martin Luther emerged a few years later, when, in 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. He was not acting in a historical vacuum, but on a field already ablaze, fueled by decades of ecclesiastical excess. Luther expressed what millions already felt, that God had been hijacked by Rome and sold to the highest bidder. The Reformation was not only a doctrinal revolution, but also a reaction to the rot left behind by the Borgias and other popes. Without their corruption, Luther might have been just an isolated voice, but against the backdrop of Alexander VI's legacy, his words sounded like a cry for justice. Thus the Church, which had not reformed itself from within, ultimately pushed the Christian world into a historic schism that would never fully heal. The moral decline of the papacy under Alexander VI not only left immediate wounds, but also created a structural distrust that the Catholic Church would carry for centuries. After the Borgias, the Vatican desperately tried to restore its image by promoting more ascetic and reformist popes, convening councils, issuing bulls, and reorganizing religious orders. But the damage had already been done. The people no longer listened with blind faith, but with skepticism. Every new gesture of humility was perceived as political manipulation, every act of mercy as a propaganda strategy. Even when popes, such as Adrian VI or Pius V, sincerely attempted to reform the clergy, they were confronted with an institution that was fragmented and torn between the need for change and the fear of losing power. The Protestant Reformation, which began in part as a direct response to the legacy of corruption, spread with force precisely because people no longer believed in the papacy's ability to reform. Religious wars, schisms, persecutions, and clashes between Catholics and Protestants defined the centuries that followed, and in all these events the shadow of the past loomed large, an institution that, instead of serving the soul, used it for its own interests. It took generations for the Vatican to restore at least some of the lost trust, and even then it never managed to regain it completely. Even today, when talking about the dark history of the Church, the name of Alexander VI continues to be mentioned as a symbol of the deepest moral collapse. The price of this era was not only the loss of territory or believers, but also the erosion of the spiritual trust of millions. Because when the sacred becomes an instrument of ambition, it is not only people's faith that is broken, but faith itself. Few names capture the collective imagination as much as the Borgia family. Their history, intertwined with blood, ambition, pleasure, and betrayal, has inspired generations of writers, playwrights, artists, and filmmakers. From the first Renaissance chronicles to modern television series, the Borgia legend has been reimagined time and again as a symbol of corruption in its most compelling form. Novelists such as Mario Puzo and Victor Hugo have explored their legacy, while modern series such as The Borgias or Los Borgia have brought their dark world to millions of screens. But what makes the Borgias inexhaustible material for artistic interpretation is not only their power or immorality, but also the human drama behind each scandal. Lucrezia, with her mixture of victim and villain, embodies the eternal dilemma of a woman caught between desire and duty. Cesare, with his cruelty and charisma, is the archetype of the tragic anti-hero. Alexander, the seducer of souls, embodies the fall of the sacred before the desire for domination. Each of them is more than just a caricature. They are dark mirrors of our own passions and fears. Art, from Baroque oil paintings to historical novels, has found in them not only monsters, but also deeply human beings, entangled in an era without redemption. Their story has been told with elements of obscurantism, yes, but also with aesthetic admiration. Because the Borgias, like great myths, are remembered not only for what they did, but also for what they continue to tell us about power, family, religion, and the price of the forbidden. Although they have been portrayed as archetypes of evil for centuries, the Borgias can also be seen as deeply tragic figures, caught up in a system that rewarded betrayal and punished virtue. It is easy to condemn them from the moral distance of our time, but when viewed from the perspective of their era, a more complex picture emerges. Cesare was not born a monster. He was a son raised by a father who expected greatness at any cost, an ambitious young man to whom the church gave no clear identity. First a cardinal, then a warrior, always homeless. Lucrezia, used as a political pawn, was forced into arranged marriages, manipulated from childhood to satisfy family pacts. Even Alexander VI, though mired in corruption, was not a demon in a vacuum. He was a product of the already rotten Roman Curia, where advancement required dark alliances and a sharp smile. From this perspective, they are not simply villains, but victims of an order in which virtue was considered weakness and redemption impossible. Many modern chroniclers have begun to humanize their images, showing the Borgias not only as agents of evil, but also as reflections of the moral collapse of an entire era. They are tragic figures, not because of their fate, but because they had choices, and despite this, they chose to fall. This duality makes them an eternal source of fascination, because it makes us wonder what we would have done if we had been born in their golden tunics. with the same pressures, the same temptations, and the same thirst for survival. The big question that haunts the memory of the Borgias is not whether they were corrupt, but whether their corruption was inevitable. Were they victims of a rotten church structure or conscious architects of a kingdom in decline? This moral tension turns their legacy into a living dilemma. On the one hand, everything in 15th century Rome encouraged unbridled ambition. Offices were bought, votes were manipulated, and popes were princes rather than pastors. In such an environment, it was not illogical for Rodrigo Borgia to use his political skills to climb the ladder. It was not natural that he raised his children as instruments of power, but many other spiritual and aristocratic people, even cardinals, lived in this world without going to such extremes. No one forced Alexander VI to surround himself with assassins, or Cesare to become a ruthless war machine. The difference between being part of the system and redefining it lies in willpower. The Borgias did not simply adapt to corruption, they perfected it, turning the church into a secular court where salvation was traded like a noble title. In this sense, they were not symptoms of the disease, but the architects of the machine that destroyed the soul of the institution. This moral ambivalence makes them figures who, despite their discomfort, are important for understanding how unlimited power can corrupt not only people, but everything it touches. Ultimately, history has not yet decided whether to condemn them for their actions or sympathize with them for the world that made them possible. The story of Pope Alexander VI is not just a tale of scandals and power. It is an eternal warning about how ambition can defile even the most sacred. The Catholic Church, which was supposed to be a spiritual refuge for the people, turned into a theater of intrigue, where cassocks hid daggers and altars served as a stage for political negotiations. Under his rule, faith was used as a tool, doctrine was manipulated, and the figure of the Pope, supposedly the successor of Peter, became a secular throne from which favors, punishments, and riches were distributed. Alexander VI's ambitions were not only personal, but also institutional, contaminating his entourage, degrading the liturgy, and leaving an indelible mark on the history of the Church. The tragedy lay not only in his desire for power, but also in the fact that he pursued it from the very center of Western spirituality. The figure of Christ was eclipsed by a pope who behaved more like an emperor than a shepherd. When the divine becomes a servant of politics, when the sacred becomes a commodity, the collective soul suffers a deep wound, and this wound cannot be healed by decrees or new popes. It is passed down from generation to generation as silent distrust. Alexander VI embodies this betrayal of the spirit not because he succumbed to temptation, but because he made temptation the norm and with it led the very soul of the Church into a dark night, from which, in many senses, it has never fully emerged. When the boundaries between religion and politics are blurred, morality does not dissolve. It is sacrificed. During the papacy of Alexander VI, this fusion reached its most poisonous form. Instead of being a sanctuary of spiritual contemplation, the Vatican functioned as a feudal court where marriages were arranged, alliances were forged, murders were committed, and inheritances were transferred, all under the banner of divine authority. Decisions were no longer made in the light of faith, but in the shadow of family interests. Sermons were reduced to justifications for ambition, and cathedrals became theaters of power. In this context, religion ceased to be a guide and became merely a justification. Believers attended Mass with the same skepticism with which they watched political performances. They knew that gold was hidden behind the incense, and behind the blessings were threats. The most disturbing thing was not only the immoral behavior of the Borgias, but also the normalization of this behavior within the institution. Alexander VI was not a random exception, but a reflection of a system that had lost the meaning of its mission. Politics, having invaded the sacred, not only corrupted people, but also disfigured the very language of salvation. Words such as redemption, grace, and sin became empty, used to justify military alliances or condemn political enemies. The loss of morality during this period was not simply an ethical crisis, but a structural distortion of the religious soul of Europe, and the consequences such as reforms, schisms, and religious wars became the bloody price for the confusion between the pulpit and the throne. The story of Alexander VI does not belong solely to the past. Although his crimes and excesses belong to the Renaissance, his legacy continues to resonate in the present as an uncomfortable echo that cuts through centuries and structures. Every time a religious institution finds itself embroiled in scandals involving abuse, corruption, or cover-ups, the specter of the Borgias returns as a reminder of what happens when power is placed above ethics. The figure of the Pope as a symbol of spiritual leadership is constantly under pressure from the political, economic, and social demands of the modern world. And although times have changed, the temptation to use the sacred for personal gain remains as relevant as it was in the 15th century. Alexander VI teaches us that no institution, no matter how divine it claims to be, is immune to falling if it does not set clear boundaries, if there is no transparency, and if its spiritual mission is confused with earthly ambition. In a world where many people still seek meaning, refuge, or truth in religious beliefs, the wound left by corrupt pontiffs continues to fester. The loss of prestige affects not only leaders, but also destroys the faith of ordinary believers. Therefore, their history should not be merely an archival curiosity, but serve as a living warning. In an era when trust in institutions is in crisis, looking back and understanding how it was lost and how it can be regained is a pressing necessity. Because if the Borgias teach us anything, it is that